I'd like to welcome everybody to PSY 222, our Lifespan Developmental Psychology course at the college. I'm your teacher, Professor S, or Professor Sherman. I actually like Professor S better. I'll be your guide through this course, and hopefully we'll have a very pleasant journey together. So let's begin. It looks like you're ready to begin our course. Our course is Lifespan Development, a psychology offering at our college, SCCC. It is PSY 222. It would be a different offering number at a different college. Perhaps you're in section 1 if it's a daytime class, or perhaps you're in section 71 or 72 if it's a nighttime class. It's good to know you might be asked, for example, by the registrar sometime. You might have noticed in the chapter 1 module, you had 3 different options in terms of this lecture. The one that you're listening to now is one, as well as one labeled printer friendly, and that one I use very little color. I try to minimize fonts. I sometimes combine slides. So if you're using your own printer and ink instead of the college's, this might be the one you want to choose. Or if you just prefer less busy slides, again, that might be a good choice. The third option is the YouTube version, which has been loaded up onto YouTube. It offers closed captioning, so you can actually see the narration, which is very convenient. Unfortunately, any link that you see cannot be accessed to the YouTube video, so you'd have to use one of the other 2 versions to actually click on the links. And usually if I include a link, usually I do put a question on it on the quiz, and often that question appears on the test as well. So absolutely positively make sure you visit all the links as well. Your text for this class is an OER, in other words, open educational resources, meaning it's free, as well as quality, so I'm sure you're pleased with that. Your particular text is organized into 9 modules. And some modules have considerably more content than others. So for example, the module for module number 1, we're going to do into 2 parts over 2 weeks. I'm sure this might please you all. So it's simply titled Lifespan Development. This is where you should probably begin taking notes. Take notes in this course in the same manner that you would take it in a face-to-face class, assuming you take good notes in a face-to-face class. It will not be sufficient to do well in the course, or perhaps not even pass it, if you don't listen to the narrations. So copy information in your notebook, or maybe directly on slides that you've printed out. Definitely put the summary points from the narrations, and you'll be off and running. Students often ask if they should take notes on the text. I do actually touch on that question in the syllabus, but just in case you missed it, no, you do not need to take notes on the text. Really answer the text questions for each quiz, and definitely verify your answers before you click submit. That way you should get your 100%. The only questions that I will take directly from the text will appear on your text quizzes. So yes, you'll have to know and study the text quizzes, but that limits the information quite a bit. I think expecting the entire text would be an overwhelming activity. Expecting you to know and learn the information on your text quizzes, I think is quite doable. Hopefully you'll agree. At SUNY Schenectady, we offer 3 developmental psychology courses: child psychology, adolescent psychology, and lifespan development. Of course, the one that you're now taking. Child psychology is a 4-credit course, particularly useful if you're going into the educational field, such as early childhood or kindergarten and grades 1 and 2. It's a 4-credit course and does require classroom observation. Adolescent psychology would be great for people focusing on the adolescent age group. Although it's not considered to be a psychology course, because it is not, we do offer a criminal justice course called juvenile delinquency. So if you're going to be working with teens, that would be a particularly good offering as well. for example, for a liberal arts elective or a general elective, and the lifespan course that you're now in, which looks at development from birth until death and everything in between. That symbol, if you're not familiar with it, is the psi, as in PSI, not SIGH. It's a letter of the Greek alphabet, and it's been adopted by the field of psychology to stand for psychology. It's a lot easier and quicker to write than the word psychology or even psych, so a friendly suggestion that if you haven't met it before, make friends with it and use it. It'll make your life easier. Let's now turn our attention to the 4 goals of psychology. The first one, describe, or description is perfectly fine. I think it's a simple concept, and yet years of teaching have told me and instructed me that it is not the case. So look at the picture there and write a brief description into your notes. If this was a non-virtual class, that is face-to-face, I would make that particular gesture in front of you and ask you to give me, again, a good description. So please describe what you see in that box. And you'll find that you may have a very good answer, or you may not even be in the remote ballpark. We'll have to see. So generally my answers fall in one of 2 categories, the correct and the not correct. Let's start with this example. Thumbs up. Other students might say, good job. Another student might say, left arm held out, fingers curled in, thumb pointing upwards. Well, clearly the thumbs up and good job is a very different sort of answer than the one with the fingers being curled and the thumb pointing upwards. The first 2 are not descriptions at all. They are interpretations. The last example with the fingers curled and thumbs up, that is a description. For example, if we went to every culture in the planet and were able to speak every language, the description would be the same. But the interpretation, which has nothing to do with the description, the interpretation which some of the students tried to give me would vary from culture to culture. So this could mean good job. That's one interpretation. It could mean thumbs up. If you're looking at somebody standing beside a vehicle with smoke coming out of it and they're doing this gesture, it probably means that they need a ride. Should you do this particular hand gesture in the Middle East? Definitely not. It's very similar to one of our hand gestures, one that you would not do in a classroom setting or even polite settings. I am told, based on a sheet, that if you do this in a German bar versus a Japanese bar, it will either get you 1 or 5 beers. I do not frequent either German or Japanese bars, so that'll be that. Consider a different example if you find this fun. Let's say that I shake my head left to right. The description would be head being moved left to right. But what would the interpretation be? Well, in our culture it would mean no. But in various cultures in the world, head going left to right means yes. So let's say that you're in a particular country and a person comes up to you and asks you, would you like to buy the services of a prostitute? You're shocked and vigorously shake your head left to right, meaning yes. And now you are now, unfortunately, haggling over a prostitution purchase. Probably not your intention. So again, description is the same. The interpretation, the explanation, that's a different step altogether. In terms of the answer to that very excellent question, which 2 are emphasized by developmental psychology? Since that's a text question, I'll refrain from answering it, but I will give you the sizable hint that will be found under the heading, Who Studies Human Development and Why? Which occurs very early in your Chapter 1 module. Hopefully that was helpful. Developmental psychology studies how we change across the lifespan in 3 distinct areas: physical development, cognitive development, and socio-emotional development. We offer a few developmental courses at the college. Child psychology is a 4-credit course designed especially for people that will be teaching toddlers or infants. Developmental psychology, Psych 222, studies development from before birth, in other words, prenatal development, through senescence, aging. We also have adolescent psychology, which is a great course for individuals that will be working with adolescents. If you are interested in working with adolescents, there is a criminal justice course called juvenile delinquency that also might be of great interest, even though it is not a developmental psychology course per se. We look at this change in continuity over 3 domains of development for every age range we explore in this class. Physical, which I think is obvious. Cognitive, which might take a moment of thought. Hopefully you remember from intro psych that it refers to thinking and mental processes. So that would be the cognitive, thinking, mental process domain of development. And emotional social, or more often called socio-emotional. It rolls off the tongue more easily. But we'll learn on the next slide that there's another common way of referring to the third domain, which we'll treat as being interchangeable. But we'll have to wait to the next slide to see what that could be. This slide is basically the same as the previous one, but uses the term socio-emotional, the easier to say version of the word. Other textbooks, teachers, researchers might, instead of using the term socio-emotional, or the more laborious emotional social, as psychosocial. So consider psychosocial and the other two terms, particularly socio-emotional, to be totally interchangeable. Let's now consider the two gentlemen seen in this slide. On the left, you'll see the individual that's often considered to be the father of developmental psychology, or at the very least, the father of American developmental psychology. His name would be G. Stanley Hall. He was the first American to earn a PhD in psychology. He was the first father of the American Psychological Association. He established the first psychological laboratory in the United States. But relatively few non-psychology people are familiar with him. This contrasts to the individual on the right, Jean Piaget, the Swiss researcher who focused on children's cognition. He's often considered to be the most famous of all the developmental psychologists. His niche was child psychology, one of the developmental fields, as we learned earlier. So, originator versus most famous. When you get to the last slide in this chapter, you notice that G. Stanley Hall is seated next to Sigmund Freud on the far left of that particular picture. G. Stanley Hall's approach to developmental psychology was called the normative approach. He saw development as a maturational process, meaning largely controlled by genetics. You might think of it as the unfolding of a flower in the sun, controlled by forces not determined by the flower itself. In terms of his stage of development that he focused on, he was particularly interested in adolescence. And if you take adolescent psychology, or in this course also, you'll learn the term Sturm und Drang, or at least the American equivalent of Sturm und Drang, storm and stress. He thought adolescence was inevitably a stormy time of testing boundaries, learning about self, emotional appeal, and so on. Not necessarily the case, but his particular perspective. Let's next consider Jean Piaget, pioneer of children's cognition. Piaget learned about his interest, children's cognition, in several ways. He would design laboratory tasks, such as the conservation task that you're probably familiar with the liquid being poured from container to container and inquiring if the child thinks it's the same or more. Tests of egocentrism, such as the 3-mountain test, which you probably did not cover in intro psych. He also would observe children. He would also ask children questions. in his time in Switzerland, he would sit and chat with children. Imagine that you took your child to the park and there's an elderly gentleman, and rapt conversation with your child might be alarming in today's society, but his time point, he learned, again, through actually asking children's questions. You're probably familiar with his stages shown on the next particular slide. You probably covered Piaget's stages in intro psych, that of sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. I see I have to switch the order of these in my slide a little bit. We'll discuss them in detail later on in the course, but for now, if you just learn the basic order, it might make your life much easier later on down the road. Piaget, in his view of children's maturation, stressed biological determinism, meaning the brain was in charge of when the child was able to acquire certain abilities, to move from stage to stage. It was biologically determined. But that being said, he also recognized that children will actively take an active role in their learning process and actively construct their knowledge of the world. Later on, we'll learn about two processes called assimilation and accommodation. So for now, associated with Piaget with these stages, a stress of biological determinism, and two processes that we'll learn about later, assimilation and accommodation. Let's now consider the ecological theory proposed by Urie Bronfenbrenner. At the first level, we have the microsystem. These are, maybe we'll say the word agents, that can directly impact and interact with the child. So who are the important people in a child's life? Obviously parents, siblings, or foster parents, perhaps grandparents or extended family, maybe the soccer coach, maybe the speech therapist if a child needs one, and so on. The mesosystem are the interaction between the microsystems, maybe the parent's interaction with the teacher, the parent's interaction with the speech pathologist, a soccer coach that they love or find that doesn't favor their child and doesn't use their child properly, and so on. Next, we have exosystem. These are the institutions that impact the child. Take a moment and think of what institutions. You're probably thinking perhaps school or educational institutions, obviously. How about medical institutions? The child that does versus does not get medical care. Perhaps political systems in which money is forwarded to certain school systems that benefit the child or not, and so on. Mass media, parental jobs, the list is endless. Next, we'll consider the macro system. The cultural values and beliefs. Obviously, this would change from generation to generation. Next, the chronosystem, chrono like and chronological, the time period, the historical context. People that grew up in the roaring 20s, as they were called, versus the Great Depression of the 1930s. The war years of the 1940s. The baby booming time period of the 1950s, also the time where civil rights was just about ready to, be launched. 60s, anti-Vietnam, women's liberation, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X in terms of civil rights and so on. Perhaps increased LGBT rights from the mid 2000s and to now, obviously, and so on. So the historical context that will impact the individuals living in that time period. Let's now consider two individuals, both famous, associated with the psychodynamic approach. Could also be called psychoanalytic if you prefer. Freud, the the originator of the approach and one of his major, you might call them disciples, theoretical descendants perhaps, but Erikson, one of the major Neo-Freudians, and the Neo-Freudian that had the developmental focus in particular. Freud, in terms of our course, his focus related to bodily zones and the effect of these zones in terms of stage development on the person's adult functioning and adult personality. His emphasis was on the first 5 years of life in terms of having a strong, lasting impact on that person really forever. We'll learn more about Freud later on in the course, of course. Now, Erikson, whereas Freud was considered to be obviously psychodynamic, psychoanalytic, Freud's theory is often termed the psychosexual theory. Erikson, on the other hand, his theory, as you might know from Interpsych, was called psychosocial, as you probably know. Erikson saw each individual passing through a series of stages in which there could be a good possible outcome versus a bad possible outcome. The issue of that stage may or may not be resolved. So he had more of an emphasis on the individual's unique history and unique experiences. But like Freud, he did see conflicts between the biological drives and the social expectations associated with each stage. The next slide will compare the stages associated with each theorist. In terms of our course, perhaps the biggest difference between Sigmund Freud and Erikson conceptually is in terms of Boalte's view of life as development being lifelong. Freud thought that the fundamental aspects of personality and our unconsciousness and unconscious conflicts, all those things were occurring prior to age 5. So the early formative years before age 5 had a tremendous impact on later life. Versus Erikson, shown on the left in this picture, of course, saw each state of development as being important, and each one can either be successfully met in terms of the challenges or not, but they would still go on to the next stage. So Erikson having 8 stages that reflect every age of development versus, again, Freud thinking that the first 5 years have a overwhelmingly huge impact on all future stages. Let's now consider the great learning theorists. In Intropsych, you probably learned that the learning approach had another name for it. Do you remember? If you're thinking behavioral, behavioristic, behaviorism, that would be exactly correct. So this would be our 3 great learning or behavioral theorists. Take a moment and look at them and see how many you recognize. Probably you recognize the gentleman on the left is Ivan Pavlov, associated with the discovery, if you will, of classical conditioning. The middle individual, of course, be John B. Watson, associated with the famous or perhaps infamous Little Albert experiment on conditioning. And on the far right, we have one B.F. Skinner, associated with operant, also known as instrumental conditioning, emphasizing the role of reinforcement and punishment. Take a moment and see if you can fill in the blanks. I'll pause here. So how many stages and what are the specific stage names for Freud, in other words? Well, hopefully you know 5 or counted 5. The stages, you might be inclined to say psychoanalysis, but no, that's Freud's therapy. You might be inclined to say psychodynamic or analytic. No, that would be his general theory. You might say psychosocial. No, that would be another Freud-related person. Hopefully you're thinking, or now are thinking, psychosexual. So 5 stages: oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. And underneath the covering of the thing, birth to 2, 2 to 5 or 6, 5 or 6 until puberty, and puberty afterwards forevermore as long as you live. Let's consider Neo-Freudian Erikson for a moment. There are other famous Neo-Freudians: Karen Horney, Carl Jung, Alfred Adler, Harry Stack Sullivan, which comes from the hills from outside my little town in Norwich, New York. But focusing on Erikson, as you can see from this slide, he is associated with not sexual, but specifically psychosocial development. He has, as you can see, 8 stages, focusing on psychosocial development. Each stage has a positive outcome versus a bad positive outcome. And so each stage, the person may or may not successfully resolve it. Perhaps they can resolve it successfully in the future. If they don't, then. So whereas Freud had an emphasis on the first 5 years of life in terms of impact on the rest of the life, Erikson really doesn't emphasize any stage over the other one. So before you listen to the answers, go ahead and actually do the slide. You'll get a lot more out of it. So if you haven't, it's okay to go ahead and pause it, but I'll assume that you already have. So let's start with the bottom and look upwards and pair it. Psychodynamic theorists. Okay, we've got 2 possibilities. But psychosexual stages, that would indeed be Sigmund Freud. Child psychologist, focus on cognition, that would be Jean Piaget. Learning theorist, okay, we've got a couple possibilities, but the one with operant, or in other words, instrumental conditioning, that would be B.F. Skinner. Psychodynamic theorist with the psychosocial stages, that would be Erikson, student of Freud. Research was foundational to desegregation. That would be Mamie and Kenneth Clark. Learning theorists associated with classical conditioning of little Albert, that would definitely be John B. Watson. The ecological systems theorist, that would be Uri Bronfenbrenner, who unfortunately died quite young. First woman to qualify for a PhD in the U.S. in psychology, who unfortunately never earned it because she was a woman. You can't give a woman a PhD, at least by Harvard's thoughts back then. That would be Mary Whitton Calkins. Theorist with the normative focus, that would be Paul Baltes. And learning theorists with classical conditioning, it looks like I might have left off Paul from the list of, oh, have they add him. And then learning theorists with classical conditioning, of course, that could be John B. Watson, but since we've already used him, let's go with the founder of classical conditioning, of course, Ivan Pavlov, Nobel laureate, not for classical conditioning, but study of digestive tract. The purpose of the slide actually morphed quite a bit as I constructed it. First, I want to show that these early psychologists were once people of youth. All the pictures you tend to see are people showing them in their 60s, 70s, or beyond. I wanted to include a picture of Jean Piaget and Erikson. I couldn't find any of either one of those gentlemen that were prior to, well, Erikson I found one in probably his early or mid-60s, and that's the earliest you can see for him, and Piaget much older. Even the statue of Piaget shows a very elderly man in his 80s. So 3 of these individuals in the kind of the center of the slide have been discussed before in the course. The largest picture, you might notice the size of the gentleman's forehead is a distinguishing feature even in youth. Take a moment and see if you recognize either one of the middle 3, or hopefully the couple on the right. So starting top center, that would be John B. Watson of Little Albert fame. Below him would be one B.F. Skinner. To the left, that would be Sigmund Freud. Now to the individuals that you might not know, when I completed the slide, it jumped out to me that there was no women on the slide, suggesting maybe there are no women in psychology of note. So I thought I would add an early great psychologist. And around in the year 1900, she was considered to be in the top 50, and she was ranked actually number 12. Her name is Mary Whidden Calkins. You might say she was the first woman PhD, depending on how you defined it. She met all the qualifications of getting a PhD. William James remarked about her that she was brilliant in terms of her examination, but she did not receive a PhD from Harvard then or even posthumously because she was a woman. And you might wonder, well, why did Harvard let her in if they weren't going to grant a PhD? I assume that they felt that she would in no way meet the qualifications for a PhD, which she did. So early psychologists of note, she was considered among the first generation of most important psychologists. She was one of the presidents of APA. She established one of the first psychology laboratories, not the very first, but one of the very first psychology laboratories in the U.S. in Wellesley College. Thumbs up to Wellesley College. So a little bit about the women in psychology. Now the couple at the right, their study always ranks in the top 25 of most important psychology studies. I would place it personally in the top 3. Perhaps you've come across them before. That would be Kenneth Clark on the left, his wife, Mamie Clark, on the right. They conducted the famous doll study or doll experiment. This study was reviewed and cited by a U.S. Supreme Court decision, Brown versus the Board of Education, that led to desegregation in this country. So I wanted to just do a shout out to, in general, psychology is not just a science of white men, but a psychology, hopefully, of all. Just something to think about as you think about psychology, and maybe seeing your role in psychology. It has room for all. Previous slide, we met G. Stanley Hall and Jean Piaget. Let's now consider the most famous and important individual to the entire field of developmental psychology. He's a German psychologist, and he gave us the perspective that we're using in this course, that of the lifespan approach, the lifespan perspective to developmental psychology. His approach emphasized certain principles of development. So let's consider them, some briefly and others will wait and explore more in this chapter. First principle you see, lifelong. That development is continuous and proceeds through all the different stages. It's not just limited to childhood, for example. Contextual, that the context the person finds themselves in will influence their development, and often they will choose context, so it's often a two-way process. They choose the context impacts them, and back and forth, back and forth. Plastic or plasticity, we'll address that later in this chapter. Also in terms of cohort, SES, and culture. Let's consider the last two concepts in detail here, multidimensional versus multidirectional. I know they're a little bit easy to confuse. They have overlapping letters, and dimensions versus directions do have some degree of a relationship to each other, but let's tackle it. Multidimensional. That'd be emphasizing the 3 domains. And what are they? Well, physical, cognitive, in other words, intellectual, and socio-emotional. So that would be the multidimensional emphasis. Now, in terms of the multidirectional emphasis, consider that development is not a nice, linear, simple progression. Certain things develop at certain time periods much more than others. Things can also be diminished as time passes. become less important. Consider perhaps a young child and their recognition of language sounds. All babies can make a rolling R. I can no longer make a rolling R sound for many languages, including Spanish. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. So that the young baby can make all the sounds and can also hear all the different sounds. As we become better at our own language, let's just say that it's English, which does not include the rolling R sound, we both lose our ability to make certain sounds and to hear, to distinguish certain sounds. So as we become more proficient in our language, we lose. So some areas accelerating, expanding, other areas being diminished. And this is across so many domains of development, so many areas of development. But that was just one example, and hopefully that helped a little bit anyway. I should mention that Paul Bathes left this world fairly recently, in 2016. Let's examine the principle and context from both these in a little bit more detail. There are three systems of contextual influences. They have no particular order, but let's start with the normative age-graded events, then we'll consider non-normative events, and then normative history-graded events. For the first one, the normative age-graded events, there are things that happen to many individuals of a given culture at a certain age, hence the age-graded. It can be related to a biological event, or it can be something that's typically undertaken at that culture at a particular time. So, for example, going to kindergarten at age 5. Maybe a girl's first menstruation around age 11 or 12, though sometimes sooner, sometimes later, but those would be two good examples. Non-normative events that we wouldn't necessarily experience or expect to experience. So it could be having one's college shut down. It could be a parent losing a job, or a parent being deployed overseas. It could be being diagnosed with cancer at a young age. Normative history-graded events are historical events that impact a generation. For example, you have probably participated in active shooter drills. When I was in elementary school, we would do duck and cover under the desk in case of a nuclear attack. So normative history-graded. Think of people growing up in the Great Depression. Nothing was thrown away. We're losing this generation right now on rapid numbers. My father's part of this generation. Perhaps people that grew up when cars were introduced. Maybe people who grew up when internet was first introduced. People who grew up, or people of a certain age when cell phones. So this is impacting people of a given culture in a particular niche in history. If you're comfortable with this, go and consider the 4 examples on the bottom and identify them. So being held back or skipping a grade, both not typical events, that would be non-normative. Most children staying between 10 months and 12 months, that would be a normative age-graded event. Losing a parent as a child or a teen, thank goodness, non-normative. And today's children participating in active shooter drills, a normative history-graded event. Another basic issue of development is there one course of development or are there many? One course would suggest that all children follow a very similar path. Many would suggest that there are distinct paths that would be influenced by the unique combination of genetics and environment experienced by the child. Your textbook gives the example of the parenting style of the Ache Native Americans of South America and Paraguay. The forest environment is dangerous, things that can put in the baby's mouth, wildlife that could be dangerous, spiders, snakes, and so on. So the Ache mothers will carry the infants upon their body for 2 years. So at 2 years, the Ache baby's motor ability is quite comparable to an American's ability at 1 year of age. That should, if there's one course of development, produce very different developmental outcomes. The Ache baby should not have the same degree of confidence in motor skills that an American baby would have. But that is hardly the case. Ache children, for example, at 9, are far ahead of American children, suggesting in fact that there are many courses of development. In a different example, I gave you a picture of Native American parents, a Native American woman with her infant in a cradle board on her back. Same idea. In Native American culture and many cultures, people are nomadic and moving and cannot place the baby in a playpen or a crib, so the baby is much safer on the back. Although the babies will initially lag behind in motor skills, they will rapidly catch up to children in cultures that were allowed more free movement. I thought it might be interesting to show you what the Ache people look like. On the left-hand side, you see Ache ceremonial makeup, which you would probably not see unless you were at a festival. If you visit the Ache, you'll probably more see a scene on the right. That crowd of people is rooting for their children at a soccer tournament. Obviously, development isn't the interplay between biology and environment. This slide focuses on environment. Environmental forces obviously include family, SES, which is discussed in the next slide, poverty or the opposite, affluence, neighborhoods, schools, and cultural context. The field of lifespan psychology is scientific, applied, and interdisciplinary. Scientific meaning it's one of the sciences. You might ponder what type. Hopefully you know it's not a basic science or natural science, but we use the term social science, or if you prefer, behavioral science. Applied meaning we not only want knowledge for the sake of knowledge, in other words, basic science, but we also want to apply what we learn. So it's also an applied science as well as a basic science. And it's interdisciplinary. So your text draws information from education, from cognitive disciplines, from neuropsychology, and many other disciplines. So interdisciplinary, drawing from the wealth of educational resources. So let's look at its major themes. We're going to start by examining 3 basic issues in developmental psychology. The first is development in its nature, continuous or discontinuous. Continuous implies that there's no substantial difference from, let's say, day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year. Discontinuous, on the other hand, suggests that there are distinct differences. With a theory that lists stages, such as the Kohlberg theory of development of morality, Piaget's theory perhaps, Erikson's theory, we'll be discussing all those in this particular chapter. They all have stages. Would that imply continuous or discontinuous development? If you said discontinuous, we're right. If you hear gentle rattling and tapping and jiggling in the background, please try to ignore it. That's Bailey, my new rescue dog. He's been here for just 24 hours. So far, we've discussed a few basic themes of developmental psychology. Is development continuous or discontinuous? Is there one path or many? Another basic issue is that of stability versus plasticity. Stability means that the differences that we're born with persist across the entire lifespan. The other alternative viewpoint would be plasticity. Now, perhaps you learned plasticity in intro psych and learned it as the neuron's ability to recover after damage, or perhaps the context was in a learning chapter. The neurons will modify after learning, such as the shape of the synapses and the dendrites and so on. Well, that's another way of looking at plasticity, perfectly acceptable for those areas. But within our course, it'll refer to that there'll be not only the stability that we mentioned, but there's also considerable change. And development can be impacted by all sorts of influences, whether it's environmental toxicities, stress, trauma, learning, proper nutrition, disease, 1,000 different things. So seeing that outcome is being shaped and influenced and modified as we progress through life. Now you might say, which one is it? Well, it is a combination of each. Some characteristics show moderate stability, but for most characteristics there is a moderate degree of plasticity also. So a person's personality style from early childhood might persist as an adult, but maybe the very shy child might learn the skills to take on certain traits of an extrovert, such as they might be a shy person, but might do a career in theater or acting, for example, in which they have to learn to display their emotions and maybe even contrive their emotions. Another basic issue of interest in many areas of science would be, in literature for that matter, would be nature versus nurture. Think for a moment and see if you can remember what the term nature and nurture would mean in this context. I'll actually go ahead and do it. So you're probably thinking, well, what do those have to do with influences of genes and genetics? Versus the other one had to do with environment and learning. True, but which is which? Well, the nurture would be those forces due to environment and learning. Nature would be due to genes and heredity. We've long moved beyond the simple nature-nurture debate. Now most disciplines focus on their interaction. Later on in this chapter, we'll learn about the 3 basic studies that explore this issue, that is the nature-nurture issue. They would be kinship, adoption, and twin. But as mentioned, we'll get into the specifics later on down the road. For this slide, I'd like to have you jot into your notes what the age ranges that you think would go into the blanks. Now, I know you could probably look them up in your text, easy as not, but take a look and try to guess what you think they might be. In some cases, they'll be quite simple, and in other cases, it might surprise you quite a bit. So go ahead and do that, and then go on to the next slide. And I did mention taking notes, so if you're taking this course as fully online, you absolutely positively to, of course, listen to the narration and take notes on them and study the notes. You'll find your test content will not only go from the slides, but particularly and importantly, the narration, as well as, of course, your questions from your text quizzes and lecture quizzes. It's a little hint that might help you study. For more hints, you can look under your syllabus under success, and you'll find hints that I found very useful and you'll find very useful in this course. So prenatal development, probably pretty easy from conception, and that is when the sperm and egg cell unite until birth. Infancy and toddlerhood, from birth to 2, or sometimes they'll list 2.5 years. I went with 2 to make your life easier. Early childhood, usually given the age range of 2 to 6 years. Middle child, usually from 6 to puberty, obviously variable between individuals, cultures, and even the sexes. Adolescence, puberty to 19 years. early adulthood, most sources will agree from 20, but no unanimous agreement whether it should end at age 40 or 45. When people died around age 50 at the turn of the century, that is between the 1900 and 1899, right at that point, 50 was the average age, so maybe 40 would have been a rather late estimate of it. But with our current lifespan, maybe 45 is a better age range, but either one we should know. So 20 to 40 or 20 to 45. Middle adulthood then would be either to 40 to 45 or 60 to 65. And late adulthood, 60 and older or 65 and older. As we go on later in the course, we'll see that there are several divisions within late adulthood as well. Two methods specific to developmental psychology are the twin and the adoption study. We'd use them if we wanted to investigate the nature versus nurture theme. Well, another set of research methods that are also used extensively in developmental psychology would be two methods that study age-related change. In other words, how we change across the lifespan. You can see that they're the longitudinal and cross-sectional study. In the longitudinal study, you see the word long, and that will help you. You follow the same group of people for a extended period of time. So for example, maybe we want to follow a group of people from age 2 to age 8. That study would obviously take us 6 years. Good longitudinal studies may last a decade or more. When they come out, they generate a lot of sensation in the academic community, and they're cited quite extensively. They're quite important, but they are quite difficult and expensive to conduct. Another alternative, which is not quite as strong, but still very useful, is the cross-sectional study. In a cross-sectional study, we'll get a group of subjects of different ages and study them at the same time. So maybe the researchers, in a matter of a week or 2 or 3, might investigate their topics of interest in a group of 2-year-olds, 6-year-olds, and 8-year-olds. So instead of waiting 6 years, they can gather that data in weeks because they're viewing people of all those ages at the same time. The big problem with the cross-sectional study is that we're not sure that the differences between the younger individuals and the older individuals are due to aging. Maybe they're due to something cultural that's going on. For example, maybe the internet was introduced, maybe social change occurred, maybe they grew up in a particular time in history. So although we would want to conclude the differences in the cohorts were due to aging, we're not positive, and that's its downfall. For the first part of this concept check, fill in the blanks. Though for the first 2 blanks, you might have to delve deep into your memories of intro psych to try to remember how many stages are associated with each theorist. And for the bottom one, for Julie versus Manuel, decide if the person is endorsing a nature or nurture explanation of alcoholism. So hopefully in intro psych you've learned about Piaget's 4 stages. And you may or may not have covered all of Erikson's 8 stages. Both reflect clearly, though, a discontinuous perspective of development, since there are clear breaks, clear separations between each stage. Now, Julie versus Manuel. Julie believes it's due to genes, so that would be the nature perspective, of course, versus Manuel believes it's due to social forces, such as being raised by alcohol and being raised in a culture which people always turn to alcohol. In the movies, they always turn to alcohol getting drunk when something bad happens. So more of a nurture perspective. So for each concept check, use it to test your studying. I'll wait to answer until after you've studied the chapter a bit. Our major tests will be timed and will not allow you enough time to look up the answers. And often you'll see applied questions. So again, don't plan on just looking at the answers. plan on learning this information as you go along. So go ahead, study and see how you do on these and check your answer. So the three domains. One was physical, one was cognitive, though I would certainly accept intellectual. Third one, was it political, social? Hopefully not. You either call it emotional, social, or easier to say, socio-emotional, or psychosocial. Next one, in terms of the steps of the scientific method, if we're going to do a four-step perspective, first one would be to create a hypothesis, formulate a hypothesis, state a hypothesis. Then you could say, test your hypothesis, or you could say, collect data. Can you do an experiment? No, because that leaves off so many research methods. So your answer would have to include all of them. So conduct a study, collect data, or some other answer that would include all the methods. Next, publish. A lot of times I hear publish, but publish what? You have no results. So perform a statistical analysis to get the results, get your results and draw a conclusion, but you'd have to analyze your data or get your results. And a lot of students stop there. Sadly, if that's a hobby at that point, it's not the scientific method. You've got to publish. Try to publish. Share what you learned. Any phrasing to that effect.